This 1912 photograph hides a mystery that baffled experts for over a century, until today. The photograph arrived at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History on a sweltering August morning in 2019, tucked inside a cardboard box that had been discovered during the demolition of a Victorian house in Natchez. Dr. Angela Foster, a senior archivist specializing in African American genealogy and post-Reconstruction Southern history, examined the package with the careful attention she brought to every artifact that crossed her desk. Inside lay a formal family portrait, mounted on thick cardboard backing with the ornate border typical of early 20th century photography studios. The image depicted a black family of 7 posed in their Sunday finest before a painted backdrop of classical columns and draped curtains. The photograph bore the stamp of Morrison & Sons Photography, Natchez, Mississippi, and the handwritten date, April 1912. Angela had cataloged thousands of similar photographs throughout her 20-year career. Images of black families who had scraped together precious dollars to document their existence, their dignity, their humanity, in an era that systematically denied all three. These photographs were acts of defiance as much as documentation, assertions of worth in a society that insisted black lives didn't matter. She always handled them with reverence, knowing that for many families, these fragile images were the only proof that their ancestors had existed at all. The family in the photograph presented a portrait of hard-won respectability. The father, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, wore a dark suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. The mother, elegant in a high-collared dress with lace trim, sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. Behind them stood 3 children, 2 boys in matching suits and a teenage girl in a white dress with a ribbon in her hair. And seated in the front row, between the parents, were 2 younger girls, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing identical dresses with their hair in neat braids. Angela was about to set the photograph aside for routine cataloging when something made her pause. She leaned closer, adjusting her glasses, certain that her eyes were playing tricks on her. One of the young girls in the front row, the one seated to the left of the mother, had features that seemed incongruous with the rest of the family. Her hair, though braided like her sister's, was straight and light-colored, almost blonde. Her skin, visible on her face and hands, was pale, not the light brown of mixed heritage that was common in that era, but unmistakably white. Her eyes, though difficult to discern in the sepia tones, appeared to be light-colored as well. Angela's heart began to pound as she examined the image under magnification. There was no mistaking what she was seeing. A white child, dressed identically to her black sister, posed as a full member of this black family in Mississippi in 1912, the very heart of Jim Crow segregation, where such a thing would have been not just scandalous but potentially deadly. What was this child doing in this photograph? Who was she? And how had her existence remained hidden for over a century? In 1912 Mississippi, the racial order was absolute and brutally enforced. The state had led the South in codifying white supremacy into law, implementing poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that had effectively disenfranchised black voters by 1890. Segregation extended into every aspect of daily life. Separate schools, separate churches, separate water fountains, separate cemeteries. Interracial relationships were not merely illegal, but potentially fatal. Black men had been lynched for far less than looking at a white woman, and white families who violated racial boundaries faced social ostracism and economic ruin. Against this backdrop, the photograph in Angela's hands was not just unusual, it was impossible. A white child could not have been publicly acknowledged as part of a black family without catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. The photography studio would have been shut down, the family would have faced violence or expulsion from the community, and the child herself would have been removed by authorities and placed in a white institution. Yet here was the evidence, a formal portrait, professionally produced, depicting exactly such a situation. Angela began her investigation by researching the photography studio. Morrison & Sons had operated in Natchez from 1885 to 1923, serving primarily the city's black community during an era when most white-owned studios refused to photograph black subjects, or relegated them to back entrances and after-hours appointments. The studio had been founded by Abraham Morrison, a formerly enslaved man who had learned photography during Reconstruction and built a successful business, documenting the lives of black families throughout Adams County. His meticulous record-keeping had survived in fragmentary form, and Angela hoped that somewhere in those records she might find information about the family in the photograph. The studio's logbook for April 1912 contained the entry she was looking for. April 14th, 1912. Robinson family portrait. Full family, 7 persons. Paid in full, $2 to $50. The Robinson name gave Angela her first concrete lead. She turned to census records, church registries, and property documents, piecing together the history of a family that had lived and died in Mississippi over a century ago. What she found raised more questions than it answered. The 1910 census listed the Robinson household as containing Samuel Robinson, age 42, occupation, blacksmith, his wife Hattie, age 38, their children Marcus, 17, Joseph, 14, Bessie, 12, Ruth, 8, and Sarah, 6. All were listed as Negro or black. There was no mention of a seventh family member, no indication of a white child living in the household, yet the photograph clearly showed 7 people, and one of them was unmistakably white. Angela knew that census records from this era were notoriously unreliable, particularly for black families who had good reasons to be cautious about what information they shared with government officials, but the complete absence of the mysterious child from any official record suggested something more deliberate than clerical error. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that this child's existence was never documented, which only made Angela more determined to discover who she was. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through digitized church records from Natchez' black congregations, Angela discovered a baptismal registry from Zion Baptist Church that contained an entry dated March 1906. Pearl, infant daughter of Samuel and Hattie Robinson, baptized this day in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, born February 2, 1906. The entry was notable for what it didn't contain. Unlike every other baptismal record in the registry, there was no notation of the child's race, no indication of her parentage beyond the Robinson names, Pearl. Angela now had a name for the white child in the photograph, but the mystery had only deepened. If Pearl had been baptized as the daughter of Samuel and Hattie Robinson in 1906, she would have been 6 years old in 1912, the right age for the younger girl in the photograph. But how could a white child have been born to black parents? And why would a black family in Jim Crow, Mississippi claim a white child as their own, knowing the dangers such a claim would bring? Angela reached out to genealogical societies and DNA database administrators, hoping to find living descendants of the Robinson family who might have preserved oral histories or family documents that could explain the mystery. Her inquiries eventually led her to Lorraine Washington, an 84-year-old retired nurse living in Chicago, whose grandmother had been Bessie Robinson, the teenage girl standing in the back row of the photograph. Pearl, Lorraine said when Angela mentioned the name, her voice catching with emotion. I haven't heard anyone speak that name in 40 years. My grandmother told me about Pearl, but she made me promise never to tell anyone outside the family. She said some secrets had to stay buried to protect the people we love. She paused, and Angela could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. But I'm 84 years old, Dr. Foster. Everyone who could be hurt by this truth is long dead. Maybe it's time for Pearl's story to finally be told. What Lorraine revealed over the next 3 hours would fundamentally reshape Angela's understanding of the photograph, the Robinson family, and the complex realities of race in the Jim Crow South. Pearl Robinson had indeed been a white child, but her whiteness was not a matter of parentage. It was a matter of medicine. Pearl had been born to Samuel and Hattie Robinson, both of them black, both of them the descendants of enslaved people. But Pearl had been born with a condition that the doctors of 1906 could not explain, and that her family had spent their entire lives concealing. She had been born without pigmentation. Pearl Robinson was not a white child living with a black family. She was a black child whose body had betrayed her in the most dangerous way possible in the Jim Crow South. The medical condition that had shaped Pearl Robinson's life was albinism, a genetic disorder that prevents the body from producing melanin, the pigment that gives color to skin, hair, and eyes. Today, albinism is well understood, and those who have it receive support and accommodation. But in 1906, in rural Mississippi, a black woman giving birth to a child with white skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes would have faced immediate suspicion, accusation, and potentially lethal violence. Lorraine Washington had heard the story from her grandmother Bessie, who had been 12 years old when Pearl was born and old enough to remember the terror that gripped the Robinson household in the days following the birth. Hattie Robinson had labored for 18 hours before delivering a healthy baby girl. But when the midwife lifted the child into the lamplight and saw her pale skin and colorless hair, she had gasped and nearly dropped the infant. Samuel Robinson, waiting in the next room, had rushed in to find his wife weeping and the midwife backing toward the door, already formulating the accusation that would destroy the family. "That ain't no colored baby," the midwife had said, pointing at the newborn. "That baby white as cotton. Ain't no way that's Samuel's child." What happened next had been seared into family memory for generations. Samuel Robinson, a man known for his quiet dignity and careful temperament, had drawn himself up to his full height and fixed the midwife with a gaze that stopped her in her tracks. He had explained in words that Bessie would remember for the rest of her life that his grandmother, a woman who had been enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, had been born with the same condition: white skin, white hair, eyes that couldn't tolerate the sun. She had lived her entire life as a slave despite looking white, because everyone who knew her knew she was black. The condition ran in families, skipped generations, appeared without warning. Pearl was his daughter, his blood, his child, and anyone who said otherwise would answer to him. The midwife had been skeptical but ultimately convinced, or perhaps simply unwilling to challenge a man with Samuel's reputation in the community. She had agreed to keep the birth confidential, to record Pearl as simply female child, without any notation of her appearance. But the Robinsons knew that secrecy within the household was not enough. Pearl's condition would be visible to anyone who saw her, and in Jim Crow, Mississippi, a white-skinned child in a black family would raise questions that could not be safely answered. The family made a decision that would shape the next decade of their lives. Pearl would be hidden. She would not attend school, would not go to church, would not be seen in public during daylight hours. She would exist only within the walls of the Robinson home, known only to family and the most trusted friends. She would be loved, educated, and protected, but she would be invisible to the outside world. It was the only way to keep her safe. For the first 6 years of her life, Pearl Robinson existed in a kind of twilight world. She knew every corner of the family's modest home, every board in the floor that creaked, every shadow that the sun cast through the curtained windows. Her siblings, Marcus, Joseph, Bessie, Ruth, and Sarah, adored her, taking turns reading to her, playing games with her, teaching her the lessons they learned at the school she could never attend. Her mother, Hattie, taught her to read and write, to sew and cook, to carry herself with the dignity that the Robinson family prized above all else. Her father Samuel carved her wooden toys, told her stories of their ancestors, and promised her that one day, somehow, she would be able to live in the open like everyone else. But Pearl was not a child who could be easily contained. As she grew older, she began to chafe against the restrictions that kept her confined. She would sneak to the windows to watch other children playing in the street. She would ask questions that her parents couldn't answer. Why was she different? Why did she have to hide? Had she done something wrong? The pain in Hattie's eyes when Pearl asked these questions was almost too much to bear. The photograph had been Pearl's idea. In early 1912, when she was 6 years old, she had overheard her parents discussing a family portrait they planned to have taken at Morrison's studio. She had begged to be included, pleaded with tears streaming down her face, argued that she was part of the family and deserved to be in the picture too. Samuel and Hattie had refused at first, explaining the dangers, trying to make her understand that a photograph could be seen by anyone, could raise questions they couldn't answer, could put the entire family at risk. But Pearl had persisted with the determination that would define her entire life. She had pointed out that she could pass for white, that if anyone questioned her presence in the photograph, her parents could simply say she was a neighbor's child, a visitor, anyone other than what she actually was. The photograph would be kept private, shown only to family members, preserved as proof that she had existed, that she had been loved, that she had been part of something larger than herself. Against their better judgment, Samuel and Hattie had agreed. They had dressed Pearl in a dress identical to Sarah's, had braided her colorless hair to match her sister's style, had posed her between them as if she were simply another Robinson child, which, of course, she was. Abraham Morrison, the photographer, had asked no questions. He had seen too much in his years of documenting black families to be surprised by anything, and he understood that some things were better left unspoken. The photograph had been taken on April 14, 1912. It would be the only image of Pearl Robinson that would ever exist. Angela Foster published her initial findings in the Journal of Southern History in the spring of 2020, presenting the photograph and the fragmentary evidence she'd gathered about Pearl Robinson's existence. The article generated immediate interest from medical historians, geneticists, and scholars of race relations in the Jim Crow South. Pearl's case was not entirely unique. There were scattered historical records of black individuals with albinism navigating the treacherous waters of American racial categorization, but the photograph provided unprecedented visual documentation of how one family had chosen to handle an impossible situation. The article also caught the attention of Dr. Yolanda Freeman, a geneticist at Vanderbilt University who specialized in the hereditary patterns of albinism in African American populations. She contacted Angela with a proposal. If living descendants of the Robinson family could be identified and were willing to participate, DNA testing might be able to confirm Pearl's relationship to the family and potentially identify other relatives who carried the albinism gene. The results could contribute to both historical understanding and ongoing medical research. Lorraine Washington, now 85, agreed to participate in the study after lengthy discussions with her surviving siblings and children. She had spent her entire adult life keeping the family secret, honoring the promise she had made to her grandmother Bessie. But the times had changed, she reasoned, and the truth could no longer hurt Pearl or anyone who had known her. Perhaps it could even help others. Families dealing with albinism today who might find comfort or guidance in knowing that they were not alone, that others had faced similar challenges and found ways to survive. The DNA results confirmed what the family oral history had maintained for over a century. Pearl Robinson had been the biological daughter of Samuel and Hattie Robinson, carrying genetic markers consistent with African American ancestry on both sides of her family. The results also identified the specific genetic mutation responsible for her albinism, a variant in the TYR gene that was relatively common in West African populations and had been carried silently through generations of the Robinson family before expressing itself in Pearl. But the DNA testing revealed something else, something that no one had anticipated. When Lorraine's results were compared against the public genealogical databases, a match appeared. A close genetic relative living in Mississippi, someone who shared enough DNA with Lorraine to be a descendant of one of the Robinson children. When Angela traced the connection, she discovered that this person was not descended from Marcus, Joseph, Bessie, Ruth, or Sarah. This person was descended from Pearl. The match in the DNA database led to a 67-year-old woman named Diane Porter, who lived in Jackson, Mississippi, and had submitted her DNA to a genealogical service, hoping to learn more about her family history. When Angela contacted her and explained the connection, Diane was initially confused. She knew nothing about anyone named Pearl Robinson. Her family history, as she understood it, began with her grandmother, a white woman named Pearl Mitchell, who had married a white man named Thomas Mitchell in 1928, and had raised a family in the white community of Vicksburg, Mississippi, never giving any indication that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. "You're telling me my grandmother was black?" Diane asked, her voice wavering between disbelief and something that sounded almost like relief. "You're telling me she was passing?" The historical records confirmed what the DNA had suggested. Pearl Robinson had left Natchez sometime around 1920, when she was 14 years old. The family oral history, as Lorraine recalled it, held that Pearl had gone north to live with relatives in Chicago, where her appearance would attract less attention and she might be able to build a life outside the shadows. But the DNA evidence told a different story. Pearl had not gone north. She had gone west to Vicksburg, where no one knew the Robinson family, where no one would think to question a young white woman who appeared out of nowhere with a vague story about orphaned parents and a childhood spent in foster care. Pearl Robinson had become Pearl Mitchell, had married a white man, had borne white children, and had lived her entire adult life as a white woman. She had passed, the term used for black Americans, who, by accident of genetics or deliberate effort, lived as white people to escape the violence and limitations of Jim Crow society. She had made a choice that thousands of black Americans had made before her, trading her family, her community, and her identity for safety and opportunity, but the passing had not been complete. According to Lorraine's grandmother Bessie, Pearl had maintained secret contact with her family for years after her disappearance, sending letters through intermediaries, occasionally visiting Natchez in disguise. She had never forgotten who she was or where she came from. She had simply done what she needed to do to survive. "My grandmother never talked about her childhood," Diane said slowly, processing the revelation. "When we asked, she would change the subject or say something vague about hard times. I always thought she was hiding something painful. Abuse, maybe, or poverty. I never imagined anything like this." She paused, and Angela could hear her struggling with the implications of what she had learned. "I have lived my whole life as a white woman in Mississippi. My children, my grandchildren, they all identify as white. And now you're telling me that my grandmother was a black woman? You're the descendants of Pearl Robinson," Angela said gently. "A woman who loved her family, who was loved by them, and who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. What that means for your identity is something only you can decide." The first meeting between the two branches of the Robinson family took place in Memphis, on neutral ground, in the fall of 2021. Lorraine Washington traveled from Chicago with her daughter and two grandchildren. Diane Porter came from Jackson with her son and daughter-in-law. They gathered in a private room at a downtown hotel, 7 strangers who shared blood and history but had never known of each other's existence. The initial moments were awkward, filled with the peculiar tension of people who are simultaneously intimates and strangers. Lorraine, at 86, was the eldest person in the room and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had lived long enough to see many impossible things become possible. Diane, at 68, seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the revelation that had upended her understanding of herself and her family. It was Lorraine who broke the silence. She reached into her bag and withdrew a photograph, the same image that had started Angela's investigation, now framed in simple black wood. "This is your grandmother," she said, handing the frame to Diane. "This is Pearl sitting right there between her mama and her daddy. This is your family." Diane stared at the photograph for a long moment, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She traced her finger over the image of the pale young girl seated among her darker siblings, the girl who would grow up to become her grandmother, the girl who would spend her entire adult life hiding who she truly was. "She looks so happy," Diane whispered. "She looks like she belongs." "She did belong," Lorraine said firmly. "She was a Robinson through and through. The color of her skin didn't change that. Nothing could change that. My grandmother Bessie talked about Pearl until the day she died. She said Pearl was the bravest person she ever knew, not because she left, but because she never forgot where she came from. She never pretended her family didn't exist. She just couldn't be with them openly, not in that time, not in that place. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, ranging across generations of family history, across the divide of race that had separated these two branches for over a century. Lorraine shared stories she had heard from her grandmother, about Pearl's childhood in hiding, about her insistence on being included in the photograph, about the tearful goodbye when she left Natchez for the last time. Diane shared what she knew of her grandmother's later life, the husband who adored her, the children she raised, the secret she carried to her grave in 1987. By the time they parted, something had shifted. They were still strangers in many ways, still separated by the vast gulf of experience that divided black and white lives in America. But they were also family, bound by blood and history and the remarkable woman who had bridged two worlds without ever fully belonging to either. Angela Foster published her complete findings in 2022 in a book titled Pearl, A Family Secret in Black and White. The book traced Pearl Robinson's life from her hidden childhood in Natchez through her transformation into Pearl Mitchell of Vicksburg, documenting the impossible choices she had faced and the courage it had taken to survive. It explored the broader history of passing in the Jim Crow South, the thousands of black Americans who had crossed the color line and the families they had left behind. And it grappled with the complex questions of identity, belonging, and truth that Pearl's story raised. The book attracted national attention, sparking conversations about race, genetics, and the arbitrary nature of the categories that had defined American life for centuries. Medical professionals used Pearl's case to educate the public about albinism, emphasizing that it was a genetic condition that could affect anyone regardless of race. Historians cited the book as evidence of the fluid and contested nature of racial boundaries in the Jim Crow era. And thousands of families with their own secrets, their own relatives who had passed, their own branches that had been separated by the color line, reached out to share their stories. For the Robinson and Porter families, the publication brought a measure of closure but also opened new wounds. Some of Diane's relatives refused to accept the truth, insisting that there must be some mistake, that their family had always been white and would always be white. Others embraced the revelation, seeing it as an opportunity to reclaim a heritage that had been stolen from them by the circumstances of history. The conversations were painful, the divisions real, the reconciliation incomplete. But Lorraine Washington, watching from Chicago as her family's story became part of the national conversation, felt something she had not expected to feel: pride. Not pride in the tragedy of what Pearl had endured, but pride in the strength she had shown, the love she had never abandoned, the connections she had maintained across the impossible divide of race. Pearl survived, Lorraine said in an interview shortly after the book's publication. She did what she had to do to have a life, to have children, to be safe, and she never forgot us. She never pretended we didn't exist. She kept the letters, kept the memories, kept the love. That's what matters. Not the passing, not the secrets, not the lies she had to tell. What matters is that she survived and she remembered, and now the whole world knows who she really was. The photograph that had started it all, the impossible image of a white child in a black family, was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it became part of a permanent exhibit on the complex realities of race in American history. On February 2nd, 2023, what would have been Pearl Robinson's 117th birthday, a memorial ceremony was held in Natchez, Mississippi. At the site where the Robinson family home had once stood, the house itself was long gone, demolished decades ago to make way for a parking lot. But the city had agreed to install a historical marker commemorating Pearl's life and the family that had loved and protected her. The ceremony drew an unlikely crowd, descendants of both the Robinson and Porter branches, historians and journalists who had followed the story, members of the albinism community who saw Pearl as a symbol of resilience, and ordinary citizens of Natchez who wanted to honor a remarkable woman who had lived among them, hidden in plain sight over a century ago. Diane Porter, now 69, stood beside Lorraine Washington, now 87, as the marker was unveiled. The two women had developed an unlikely friendship over the past 2 years, bound together by the grandmother they shared and the history that had separated their families for over a century. They had visited each other's homes, attended each other's family gatherings, and slowly, painfully, built bridges across the divide that Pearl had crossed so long ago. The marker bore a simple inscription: Pearl Robinson, 1906 through 1987, born to Samuel and Hattie Robinson in this neighborhood, lived hidden due to albinism in Jim Crow, Mississippi, passed as white to survive, never forgot her family, never forgotten by them. Her life reminds us that the boundaries we draw between people are never as fixed as they seem. Lorraine spoke first, her voice steady despite her age. My grandmother Bessie used to say that Pearl was the most visible, invisible person she ever knew. Everyone could see her. She couldn't help but stand out. But no one was allowed to really see her. She had to be hidden, had to be secret, had to be erased from the records and the photographs and the family story. But love has a way of preserving what the world tries to destroy. We kept her memory alive in our hearts, in our stories, in the whispers passed down from grandmother to grandchild. And now, finally, she can be visible to everyone. Now, finally, she can be seen. Diane spoke next, her voice trembling with emotion. I spent 67 years not knowing who I really was. I thought I was white. I thought my family was white. And now I know that my grandmother was a black woman who made an impossible choice to survive in an impossible time. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of her. And I'm honored to stand here today, next to my cousins, next to my family, and say that Pearl Robinson was my grandmother. She was brave, she was loved, and she will never be hidden again. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Lorraine and Diane stood together before the marker, studying the words that would preserve Pearl's memory for future generations. The photograph that had revealed the truth, the image of a white child seated among her black family, claiming her place despite all the forces that sought to deny it, was reproduced on a small plaque beside the marker, visible to anyone who stopped to read Pearl's story. You think she would have wanted this? Diane asked. To have her secret told to the whole world? Lorraine considered the question for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph of the little girl who had grown up to become two different women, Pearl Robinson and Pearl Mitchell, black and white, hidden and visible, lost and found. I think she wanted to be seen, Lorraine said finally. I think that's all she ever wanted. Not to be white, not to be black, not to be anything other than what she was. A child who belonged to her family, a woman who belonged to herself. She spent her whole life being looked at but never seen. Maybe now, finally, people will see her. Really see her. And maybe that's what she was waiting for all along. The two women stood in silence as the Mississippi sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the parking lot where the Robinson home had once stood. The house was gone, the family scattered, the secrets revealed. But Pearl's story had survived, hidden in a photograph, preserved in memory, waiting for the moment when the world was finally ready to see what had been there all along.